Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here this morning. I'll introduce myself first. So I'm Linda Cowan, Managing Director for Kaplan International Pathways. And we worked in partnership with HEPI and also with UUKI to produce the report, along with London Economics. So we're delighted, all of us, to be here today, and we're joined by a fantastic crowd here in person, but also 2/3 of the size of this room online. So I just want to welcome everybody who's joined us online, and to invite everybody either in the room or online to post any questions for us to be asking our panellists and our speakers as we go through this morning. So we were just genuinely delighted to actually take part in this update of the net economic contribution of international students to the UK. I will myself, though, step back to say that in some ways, days like today, when actually we're recognising the excellent work that's been done by London Economics, and thank you, Gavin, for the work that's been done, I actually stand with some mixed feelings. Because to me, and I know this will be shared by many people in the room and online, international students are so much more than the net economic contribution they make to the UK. They give us so much in terms of enriching our campuses, so much in terms of interacting with home students, preparing home students for global careers. And therefore, in some ways, it does seem slightly sad when you narrow it down to the net economic contribution that international students make. But with the timing of everything that's been happening in the debate in the UK, I can't think of a more critical time for us to be bringing this research out and actually sharing it in the way that we are launching today. Certainly for a company like Kaplan, where we work with universities all around the world, and we work with universities here in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, in Ireland, in the US, the one thing that we do get to pick up really, really quickly is actually what influences the decision-making of international students. And that's why this report does resonate with me, because today, international students are very much resonated by reputation of universities, safety in the country, the employment opportunities for students either in the country they studied or back in their home country. And then fundamentally, how welcoming is that country to international students? And I think the data you're going to see in the report that Gavin will present later on, to me, means there's every single reason that we've got to stay very welcoming and do everything we can to compete with other countries to ensure that the UK stays attractive to international students. So I hope you enjoyed today's debate. I'm now going to hand over to Nick, and Nick will give a few opening remarks. Nick.
Well, thanks very much, Linda. I'm Nick Hillman, Director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and we're equally pleased to be working with the other organisations on this report on the net economic value of international students by parliamentary constituency. For those of you who are here in person, and there's more people online, I know, but there are hard copies available, and this is just the short version. There's a really detailed version with all the methodological workings available on our website and the London Economics website. Take your pick. I also want to start by thanking Gavin and Micah, who's done some of the work on this, but is based in Australia, so she's listening in online, to Jamie and his colleagues at Universities UK, and to Linda and Elizabeth Hess and their colleagues at Kaplan. I just want to make 3 points about the piece of work before we hear all the details. The first is, and one of the reasons it's so important, is it includes net numbers for the economic benefit of international students. And the reason it does that is when I was Special Advisor to the Universities Minister, David Willits, we used to have regular meetings with the then Migration Minister, Damien Green. And he used to come into us and say, well, it's obvious that international students cost as much as they bring benefits to the country. And we would say, it really isn't obvious, and we don't think it's even true. And he would say, well, prove it, because all the data I ever get given are the gross numbers, not the net numbers. And so that was why when I got to HEPI, and this is a long time ago now, because this is the third iteration of this work, we always wanted to focus and always have focused on the net numbers. Given that gross has two different meanings, I know the Home Office might see even the net numbers as gross, given their positioning, their unfortunate positioning on some of these issues. But of course, the timing of this report couldn't be any better because those issues are still very live. The second point I wanted to make is, of course, the other way this report is different to other people's reports, and there have been similar reports from other organisations coming to similarly large numbers, is that we break the numbers down for the 4 parts of the UK, for the different regions within England. So if you want to know the numbers for London, you can look them up, for example. And then by parliamentary constituency. And I'll be completely honest with you, every level of granularity, the numbers get a little bit more fuzzy because we're reliant on things like census data for where students live. But nonetheless, it's really useful, I think, to have the numbers at a parliamentary constituency level. And we have already, with UUK and Kaplan, written to every single member of the House of Commons to give them their numbers for their own constituency. And we plan, before the next general election, which is probably 18 months or so away, to try and engage with all the candidates for all the major political parties in all the constituencies up and down the UK. So if people want to oppose the presence of international students, fine, but they should only do that if they know the benefits they bring, and so they are doing it with their eyes wide open. And the third point I want to make is that, of course, this report uses the most up-to-date information. And some of those other reports I've referred to are based on pre-COVID data, for example, or using information that is now out of date. Things move so fast in this area. The policy toward, whether it's international graduates' working rights or the geopolitics where people are coming from, and as the pandemic has lessened, all these things have an impact on the numbers. So the numbers change quite often. So you do have to redo this work every now and again. And of course, there's been a really big swing up from the last time we did this work, which was only in 2021, wasn't all that long ago. And one final point, if I may, given the current political row about dependence, one point I think worth noting is, of course, one thing that has happened recently in the higher education sector in the UK is a rebalancing a little bit away from China, though hundreds of thousands of Chinese students are still in the UK, towards other countries like India, like Nigeria. And of course, Chinese students, for demographic reasons and other social reasons, are much less likely to bring dependence than students from countries like India and Nigeria. But we need to remember, when politicians beat up on the sector for international students bringing dependence with them, that it is partly a response to policymakers' own edicts to be less reliant on China. And therefore, some of these factors, it's not the universities have been encouraging dependents to come, it's that they've been attracting students from a wider mix of countries. And in many ways, it's absolutely wonderful the Indian numbers have gone up so much, because they were, demand had really been held artificially down from that part of the world. As this is my only time on the platform today, I just also want to say one other set of thank yous, which are to my colleagues at HEPI, Emma, Lucy and Rose. Emma's done a lot of the organisation of today's event in particular, and so it's my only opportunity to thank her. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass over to Jamie Arrowsmith from UUK, who will introduce Gavin Conlon, who's done the work. Thank you.
No, thank you, Nick, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today, both here in person and online, for what I think is both a hugely important and an incredibly timely report, which I have to admit is timely because of a great degree of serendipity. I'd love to say that when Nick and I were first talking about this in November, we did have the publication of the net migration figures in May in mind, but it was actually more to do with the timing of a UUK members meeting last week. So I maybe shouldn't admit that, but it has proven to be really good timing, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little later. As Nick says, we'll have Gavin presenting the results shortly. And then there'll be a panel discussion. We've got some fantastic discussants to really talk through both the strengths, some of the challenges of the report, but also of the levels of international student recruitment we've seen. But before I do hand over, I just wanted to sort of touch on a couple of points first. And really, the first one is just to emphasise what Linda said in her opening remarks, and that is that international students are not their economic impact. And I think we should not, and we should be very careful about reducing that fantastic contribution to a number in a spreadsheet. I think every international student that we host has made a choice. They've made a positive choice to choose the UK as their study destination and really to kind of realise their dreams and ambitions. And we get a huge amount of value from that as well. But in making that choice, we benefit as well as a community and as a country. And I think that's what really comes through strongly in the report. And I think that that's also a point that was made really eloquently and forcefully in The Times on Monday, who had a leader column really emphasising the wider contribution of international students, that it's not just about economic benefit, but also about the kind of the reputation and quality of our institutions as well. And I think it's really important that we recognise and reflect on that kind of drive and ambition and that kind of intellect that students add to the UK. And they're actually really important if the UK wants to prosper. So yes, there's an economic impact, but also that broader impact as well. And I think that's really where the true value lies. But the final point I'll make is that we simply cannot avoid the importance of the economic contribution for the reasons that Nick has just outlined. I'm sure that most of us here, if not everyone, recognises and really supports that broad contribution. But we also know that we have to be realistic, and it would be disingenuous to say that the economic impact is not important and that it's not important to policy and decision makers as well. And so it's really, really critical that we have this kind of evidence base that we can emphasise and evidence that broad impact. But I think what the report also sort of highlights, and I'm sure we'll come to this in the discussion as well, is that we have to acknowledge that that positive impact is not always recognised and not always felt equally across the whole of the UK. And I think it's incumbent on us as a higher education community and as a sector to really engage with and address any kind of wider concerns that are raised about international student recruitment. And also, it's really our responsibility to students, but also our community, to ensure that the reputation and quality of the education that students are getting remains world-leading, and that students are getting the experience that they demand, and that their investment demands as well. So I think that we have a real responsibility as a community to ensure that we engage with any of those concerns and criticisms, and that we ensure that the student experience is actually front and centre. But I'll stop there. I'm sure we're going to come back to many of those points through the discussion. But it is really timely to have this reminder of the responsibility that we have to students and to our communities. And that economic contribution is actually part of that responsibility. There's actually billions of pounds of investment in the UK and thousands of jobs that depend on us being able to continue welcoming international students. So if we don't take that responsibility seriously, then ultimately it's not just universities that will suffer, it will be students, but it will also be our communities as well. So I really want to encourage us all to reflect properly on what I think this report means. And for me, it's not more. It's actually about how we do things better into the future as well, and really reflect on the quality of the student experience. But I'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to the discussion later, and I'll now hand over to Dr. Gavin Conlon, partner at London Economic, who's going to talk us through the findings from the report. So please, Gavin.
So thanks, folks. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to HEPI, to Kaplan, and to UK International for commissioning this piece of work. We think it's really important. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, James Cannings and Micah Halterbeck, who contributed significantly to this piece of work. So without further ado, we'll just kick straight in. So we look at the benefits and costs associated with international students to the UK economy, and this is an analysis related to the 21-22 cohort of students. The last time we did this piece of work, we compared it to the 2018-19 cohort of students. So what do? Essentially what we do is we look at the impact associated with tuition fee income, and then non-tuition fee income, i.e. essentially the living costs, as well as tourism or visitor income associated with individuals coming to visit students undertaking or commencing their studies in the UK in 21-22. We look at students over the course of their studies, okay? So we model the expected duration of their studies and we model accordingly. On the cost side, and this is the important thing that Nick mentioned, we also look at, instead of just looking at the benefits, the gross benefits, we look at the net benefits by estimating the costs incurred by the Exchequer or the public purse associated with international students coming to the UK. Okay, so when we look at the number of students, what do we have? So let's have a look at the 21-22 cohort. So essentially we've seen this huge increase in the number of students coming to the UK over the last 2 decades. So in 21-22 there were 381,000 international students starting their studies in the UK. If we look at the breakdown, if you look on the extreme right-hand side, in 21-22 there was 350,000 non-EU students commencing their studies and about 31,000 EU domiciled students commencing their studies. So with 350,000 non-EU students, that's a 68% increase, equivalent to 142,000 students compared to the 2018-19 analysis. So that's a 68% increase from 208,000 to 350,000 students, a massive, massive increase in the number of non-EU students. On the flip side, though, as a result of Brexit and the decoupling of home and EU fees and the removal of the ability to acquire financing or HE student support, there's been a 52% reduction in the number of EU students year on year, or between 2018-19 and 2021-22. So now there's 31,000 EU domicile students starting their studies in 2021-22, and this compares to about 65,000 in 2018-19. Okay, so a very, very significant decline in EU domicile students. So what are the characteristics of students? Well, now it's the case it's 92% of international students are non-EU and 8% are EU students. 66% are postgraduate taught, with about 25% being undergraduate, full-time undergraduate degrees, and about 94% of students are full-time, with the remaining 6% part-time. Okay. Where do they come from? So about 2/3 of non-EU international students come from 3 countries. That's China, India, and Nigeria. So there's about 100,000 students commencing their studies from China, about 87,000 from India, and about 33,000 from Nigeria. In particular for India and Nigeria, this is a massive, multiple-fold increase in the number of students in the last couple of years. China's relatively stable, high but stable, but big increases from India and Nigeria, and this reflects some of the points that Nick made. In terms of EU countries, Ireland is top of the table with just over 4,000, and that's remained pretty much constant over the last decade, but there's been big falls in the number of international students or EU students coming from Germany, France in particular. So they've dropped down to about 4,000 from a much higher level. Where do these students study? Okay, so unsurprisingly, there's a very high proportion engaged in study in London. Okay, so there's about 99,000 students in London, there's about 44,000 in Scotland, and there's between 25 and 35,000 in the Northwest, West Midlands, South East, East of England, East Midlands, and Yorkshire and Humber. But there's still significant proportions or numbers in both Wales, Northern Ireland, and the North East and the South West. Okay, so international students are essentially all over the country. There is an issue in the analysis about London campuses, so it's very difficult from the official published data to identify. There may be students who are registered with institutions, for instance, in the Northeast or Northwest, but they may have London campuses. But unfortunately, the HESA data doesn't allow us to identify which students, explicitly the location of the campus that they may be studying at. There's one problem with the analysis. Okay. So if we look at the aggregate benefits associated with international students, okay, if we look at the numbers in red, so first of all, the gross economic benefit associated with EU students was £137,000. So a proportion of this, £76,000 of this economic benefit was associated with tuition fee income, and then the spillover effects or the indirect and induced effect throughout the UK economy. Then there was £59,000 of economic benefit associated with non-tuition fee expenditure, and then approximately £3,000 of economic impact on the UK economy associated with visitor income and expenditure. So the gross figure is £137,000. For non-EU students, the gross economic benefit was estimated to be about £107,000. So on average, that was £110,000 across EU and non-EU students. So if we gross this up by the total number of students commencing their studies, we identify a gross economic impact of £4.3 billion associated with EU students, about £37.6 billion associated with non-EU students, summing to about £41.9 billion being the gross economic impact. Now, the reason why the economic impact, the gross economic impact associated with EU students is greater than the gross economic impact associated with international students is because of the duration of qualification being undertaken and the composition of EU domiciled students and the qualifications they undertake, much more likely to undertake full-time first degrees. Okay, so that's why there's that difference. If we look at the economic costs, so the big difference between the previous study is the end of the transition period with Brexit. So previously it was the case that EU students were in receipt of student support in respect to tuition fee loans. So this is the grey area. So there used to be a bit of student support, and there used to be teaching grants that were paid on behalf of EU students to UK higher education institutions or some UK HEIs. That no longer takes place. So essentially the costs, when we look at the costs now, all we're doing is we're looking at the public purse costs associated with the hosting of international students. So when we look at the public purse costs, we look at essentially ONS data on the allocation or the resource allocation of the government, and we essentially identify a unit cost for each region, for each individual in each region across the country. And essentially we assume that those costs, unit costs, can be applied to international students. So we take a very broad view on what costs we include. We basically beef up the costs, okay? So we look at the costs in terms of NHS usage, net of the health surcharge. We look at the cost of defence, we look at the cost of housing, we look at the cost of, if there's any benefit entitlement. We look at the costs of, if individuals have dependents, then we look at the cost of education and service that might be provided to their children. So when we do this, we also actually even include the costs associated with servicing the national debt. I mean, we take a very extended view on what the costs are. So when we do this, we find out that for EU students, the typical cost per EU student of hosting an EU student is about £13,000 over the duration of their studies, while the typical cost for a non-EU domiciled student is about £12,000 over the course of their studies. It's slightly higher for EU students, and this is simply because of the longer duration of the qualification. So when we aggregate these numbers by the size of the cohort of EU or non-EU students, essentially we identified that the total economic costs associated with hosting EU domiciled students is about 0.4 billion, where the total economic costs associated with hosting non-EU students is about 4 billion. Okay, total is 4.4 billion. And this has to compare to the 41.9 billion I mentioned in the previous slide. So when we combine this information, the total net economic benefit associated with international students is about £98,000 on average. So it's £125,000 for an EU student and about £96,000 for a non-EU student. When we gross these numbers up, okay, we get a total economic benefit of 37.4 billion, and that is split about 3.9 billion in relation to EU domiciled students and about 33.5 billion in relation to non-EU domiciled students. Okay, so very big numbers. So what do these numbers mean? Well, there's a couple of ways we can look at it. If we look at a benefit to cost ratio, simply divide the benefits by the cost, we get a benefit to cost ratio of about 9.4. Okay? So essentially this is saying that international students put in almost 10 times as much into the UK economy as they take out. Another way of saying this is for every 9 EU domiciled students, they generate about £1 million for the UK economy. And for every 11 international, non-EU international students, they generate £1 million for the economy. So very big numbers. Okay. There is a question about whether these, there are methodology issues about these numbers because it does rely on, different data sources, et cetera, and it also relies on multipliers and what the ripple effect through the UK economy is. So there is a question about, do the multipliers overstate the extent of the gross economic impact? And the real question is, if you took out all international students, and if you took out the fee income and the non-fee income, would it be possible to replace that fee and non-fee income with some other form of income that would ripple throughout the economy? And if you think that, we could, the UK economy could, then the multipliers would be much lower. If you don't think we can, if you think there's no replacement effect, essentially, then the multipliers would be sort of close to where we estimate them to be. Okay, so how have these numbers changed over time? So we identified that the gross economic impact was 41.9 billion. When we undertook this study the last time, essentially the gross economic impact was about 31.9 billion. So there's an increase of 10 billion. Costs have increased, a little bit from 3.1 billion to 4.4 billion. But the net effect at the bottom, if we look at the net impact, the last time we undertook this study, the net economic impact was 28 billion, and now it's 37 billion. So that's a 33% increase in real terms. It's interesting to note, though, that the net economic benefit per student has declined. Okay, so it used to be £103,000, and now it's about £98,000 per student. And this masks, this gross figure masks a fair bit of variation. So the first thing is for EU students, because of the removal of student support, and because of the increase in fees that are charged to EU students following the decoupling of home and EU fees, the net economic benefit per EU student has increased from about £78,000 to about £125,000. It also reflects a slight change in the composition of the EU cohort, much more likely to be undertaking full-time qualifications at undergraduate level. In terms of international students, non-EU international students, the net economic impact has declined from 111,000 per student to about 96,000. And this reflects a change in the composition of the cohort over the last couple of years, but also an increase in the number of dependents that are brought with non-EU international students. One very interesting point about the point about dependents, we were able to look at the number of dependents that are, on average, that are accompany international students. And at the moment, per 1,000 international students, there's about 216 216 dependents per 1,000 international students. Because we look at the costs associated with dependents as part of this analysis, we tried to estimate how many dependents would have to be brought with those 1,000, those typical 1,000 international students, to make the economic costs exceed the economic benefits. Okay, and we basically modeled this, and we identified that the number was 10,400. So essentially, for the cost to outweigh the benefits, there would have to be a 48-fold increase in the number of dependents being brought to the UK. Okay, so quite a large increase. Location of impact. So unsurprisingly, there is economic impact up and down the country, every region in the UK. In London, the total economic impact associated with international students engaged in their studies in London is about £10 billion. In Scotland, the economic contribution of international students is about £4.2 billion. And then for many of the other regions, the North West, West Midlands, East Midlands, Yorkshire and the Humber, East of England, South East, the economic impact is between £2.25 and £3.75 billion. Okay, so all very, very significant. In Northern Ireland and Wales, there's also an economic impact of between 1 billion and £1.25 billion. So the contribution of international students around the country is very, very significant. And this is the contribution on the UK economy associated with where they are engaged in a study, London campuses aside. Okay. If we go to the next level, what we try and do is we try and allocate international students to parliamentary constituencies, essentially. And we use information for England and Wales. We use the most recent census data. It's not available in Scotland. But what we try and do is we assume sort of essentially similar residency patterns as individuals within the domestic population engaged in education. Okay, so the effect of this, and this is where Nick says that things get a bit fuzzy, the effect of this is to essentially spread out or distribute the economic impact by parliamentary constituency. But, and it's actually probably a little more concentrated than we would otherwise, than we present here. But what this says is that the typical economic contribution by parliamentary constituency is about £58 million, which is equivalent to about £560 per member of the resident population. Okay, but as I said, clearly it's very concentrated in some particular areas. So we have the top 20 here. Glasgow Central, the total economic contribution is £292 million associated with 3,000 international students, and that's £2,700 per member of the resident population. Number 2 is Keir Starmer's constituency, Holborn and St Pancras, and number 3, Sheffield Central, which is Paul Blomfield. So there are constituencies from every region in the UK, obviously represented here, and it just provides an indication about the net economic impact up and down the country. We also provide information on every parliamentary constituency in the report, and even for those constituencies where it might not be considered that there is any sort of significant economic impact, there is an economic impact, in every constituency in the country. And that's us. Thank you.
Gavin, for that the sort of presentation of the findings. Now, we have about kind of 10 minutes for sort of a Q&A before we move to the wider panel discussion. So if you do have any sort of questions, comments that you'd like to ask of Gavin or Linda, do put your hands up. I think we have a roving mic. And I do believe we have the ability to get questions online as well. But I think we've got one question in the room here.
My name is Obina Okirike. I'm Project Manager, Student Experience at Coventry University and TEF Deputy Panel Chair. I have a controversial question. In terms of dependence and being a former international student myself, in terms of recruitment, have we been honest to students about the, because most of the students coming to study are coming because of the post-study work visa, so have we been honest about the chances of them being able to secure employment after study? Are we being honest at the point of recruitment?
No, thank you. I think this might be better suited for our wider panel a little bit later, actually, where we do have sort of university representatives. But Linda, Gavin, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, happily pick up, Jamie. Generally, I think yes. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there's not completely, that everybody's a good actor within the sector. But I think across the sector, people have tried to give that degree of honesty in terms of the opportunities for jobs under the graduate student visa. Kaplan and HEPI did actually undertake some research at the beginning of this year, and one of the key things we were trying to look at is what's the level of awareness amongst companies on actually the ease from which you can employ international students through the graduate visa sort of route. And that did show a slightly mixed picture, which means for the sector we've got to reflect on what came back. And what generally came back from that was that large companies typically are aware of the ease of employing international students to the sector, but small and medium-sized companies are not as aware. So again, back down to I think one of the points that Jamie made in his opening remark, we've got to reflect on that as a sector in terms of what can we do that actually helps to increase the knowledge amongst employers on actually how easier it is to employ international students. So in my company in Kaplan, we make active use of it, and we've employed a number of people through that route. But I think as a sector, we can do more. And that will just generally help as we're still in these early years of the visa scheme being rolled out. Jamie, would you add anything?
Yeah, I'd just say, first of all, I do think we should come back to this in the panel discussion as well, because I think it's a really, really important point. We did actually do a report with the Association of Graduate Careers Advisory Services a couple of years ago on this particular issue called Making Good on the Promise. And it did reveal that there was actually far more that needed to be done to support international students to actually understand what the opportunities were in terms of post-study work throughout the whole time within the system as well. So starting from that point of application. So, yeah, I think it's a really important issue, though, that we should discuss a little later. Any more questions in the room at all? One over here.
I don't know. Hello? Yes, amazing. Okay, Iona, Policy Officer at UKISA, the UK Council for International Student Affairs. I'm just going to kind of comment on that point. I think the sector is doing incredibly well to try and make that post-study work visa and employability process for graduates more transparent, and there's a couple of different groups that are doing work alongside that to try and facilitate it, like the International Student Employability Group, which is run by UKISA and brings together loads of different bodies and organisations in the sector, and creates a lot of resources for employers, students and institutions to try and more understand the benefits of the graduates from international areas and, you know, understanding the visa restrictions and benefits and everything. So, yeah, the sector is really jumping on it and trying to do a lot.
No, thank you. And I think that point around collaboration is really important. It's got to be a kind of a responsibility for everyone involved. I think we've got a question at the back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear myself. I'm intrigued by a lot of the figures and numbers here, but I'm trying to work something out in my head. It feels like a timestamp, correct, of starts, but yet we're making inferences of what might happen after those folks are in those roles over a longer period of time, whether or not, you know, this conversation we were just having about working later on or matriculating into other areas. So I guess it's a combination challenge question. Do you have that data? Because obviously you would be trying to follow people, trying to do some sort of longitudinal analysis, but are you also interested in doing something like this? Because there could be lots of inferences made now around these stamps that either don't bear out because those people go to Mars or someplace else, or something else happens. And I'm just trying to get some sense of opportunities and limitations of the data.
No, thank you, Karen. Gavin.
So when we undertake this analysis, we just look at the cohort of student starters over the duration of their studies. We don't look at them post-graduation. We don't look at the taxation that they've paid. In a previous piece of work that we undertook for HEPI, we actually did do that. So we matched this with longitudinal educational outcomes data, and we identified essentially the volume of tax that was contributed by international students broken down according to their whether they're EU or non-EU students. So that analysis is out there, but it's not part of this analysis.
No, thank you, Gavin. And I've got 3 hands up here, so I'll go to the front row first.
Thanks very much. I've just got a question about how you modelled the impact by parliamentary constituency. Because I'm having a look at the map here, and it looks like Aberystwyth and Falmouth have had a massive impact, which just doesn't seem quite right to me. I know you said they were a bit fuzzy at the constituency level, but I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how you derived those numbers.
So in terms of Aberystwyth and Falmouth?
Well, I'm just looking at the dots and the colours on the map,
Yep.
which I'm guessing is Falmouth and Aberystwyth as the sort of university that's attracting international students, and they're both in the dark blue
Okay.
highest impact, which just doesn't intuitively feel quite right, with all due respect to Falmouth and ABBA.
Fair enough. I'd have to go back and have a look at that to give you a precise answer on that.
No, thanks. I mean, I can't recall from the data, I don't have the report in front of me. Is that the kind of the per capita impact, or is it the aggregate impact that's covered in that section? Maybe we can pick that one up a little later. But no, I think there was a question here.
Hi, Rob Carthy from Northumbria University. My question's about that overall figure, 41.9 billion, is a huge number. Might be slightly reductive, but I think in terms of how we're positioning this and trying to make sure we've got the right argument about the importance, the critical importance of international students to the UK, is there any benefit in having that as a comparator against other industries? Because I think that's where you start to really pitch it against other income generative industries to say, and here's how that compares. And I think that's, I don't know if that's just too reductive or whether that's something that will be useful to do.
No, thank you. I know that the FT did do something last week that said 3 UCLs were worth the entire of the UK fishing industry, but I don't know if that's where we want to go. Gavin, any kind of reflections on that?
I think it's always hard to, I mean, sometimes it's quite informative to sort of say that, the economic impact here is the equivalent to some form of taxation receipts, or a proportion of some form of taxation receipts. I think the easier thing to do is, I mean, if you look at a simple benefit to cost ratio, I mean, if it's a 9.4 to 1 benefit to cost ratio, and you compare that to, for instance, some investment in physical infrastructure, such as High Speed 2, where the benefit to cost ratio is in the region of 1 to 2 to 1, then it just gives you an indication of the relativities. I mean, it's very hard to choose something that will resonate otherwise.
Rob, can I maybe just add one point? Because I actually think it's a hugely useful question in the comparison. I think in terms of looking at other sectors, is what are the other sectors that have that level of benefit right the way across the UK, in particular outside of London. But I think if we're doing a sector comparison, it's actually down to the key point that does come through in the report is actually what this is meaning right the way across the UK that I think would be very useful.
No, thank you. And Rose, was there any questions online at all? Yeah. Could you just have one online first and then... Could you go to online first and then come to you, sorry.
I have a couple of technical questions online. First one, have there been any changes to the methodology? Matthew here did not recognise the 103,000 average net economic impact per student from the 2018-19 report.
I think there have been some small changes to the methodology, but it's predominantly the same.
And the second question, is the report breaking down the impact from tuition fee income versus the multiplicator? How sensitive is the net impact figure to the assumptions made on knock-on effects?
There will be a fundamental sensitivity to the use of the multiplier. If the multiplier is smaller than 2 point something, then clearly there will be a reduced impact, gross economic impact associated with that. I think that's one point that Alan's going to talk about in the later session. So there is always a question mark about the validity of multipliers. What we do is we use the ONS multiplier. I mean, essentially amended to look at a regional level, but essentially we use ONS standards.
No, thank you. And I guess there is the comparator with the official government data on export earnings, which just looks at that, which is around about 20 billion as well. So we do have some comparators there as well. And final question in the room.
Thanks very much. Johnny Rich from the Engineering Professors Council, amongst other places. Skeptics about international students would argue that one of the main costs is the impact on house prices and the pressure on housing and the consequent increase in house prices or accommodation costs. Is there any way of working out what the size of that issue is and setting that against the 41 billion or 42 billion?
No, thank you.
Unless you've got a general equilibrium model to rip through this, I don't think there is a way of doing that. I mean, clearly there are going to be effects associated with a large number of international students come to the UK. There are clearly there is pressure on schools every September with new with the dependence of new international students, there's pressure on housing. I mean, I suppose my point is that, you know, if it's, I would sort of say quite obvious that the economic benefits are so significant, then there's a rationale for, and the economic benefits are so significant, but they're also sort of relatively predictable, I would sort of say. So I would say that there's an economic case for, you know, government intervention in terms of, like, you know, easing those constraints that may occur elsewhere in the economy, because overall the UK economy does benefit more than, you know, significantly more than the costs incurred, even if they increase marginally.
I would probably add, and I think the panel may pick up on this, actually highlighting ways in which actually we really hope the report gets used, because actually when you look at the report and you look at the economic contribution it's making, actually what you're hoping is going to come out from this, it keeps informing policy activity and how actually the private sector can be working with universities, can be working with local government to try and increase the availability of accommodation in very cities. So you're highlighting exactly how we hope the report will get used in the future.
No, thank you. And I just, the points that I was trying to make at the start actually were in that vein, that I don't think the report should be seen as the economic impact is huge, so let's just do more. It's about doing better and actually really reflecting on what some of those very real challenges are. And I know that our panelists are going to mention some of those issues shortly. So we actually now have the very final question in the room before we move to the panel.
I'm Nunzio Quacquarelli from QS. I think it's an excellent piece of work and really important to capture that economic value. But you mentioned in your report that there are other values that international students create for the UK, which are soft power, also the long-term benefits. Have you thought about trying to measure the longer-term benefits of students going back to their home countries and then contributing to economic relations with the UK? So, for example, students who go back to become faculty of universities overseas who contribute to joint research with the UK, or alumni who become directors of international companies who have trading relations with the UK, because that value magnifies its impact, I think, dramatically, and which had a new lens.
No, thank you. I think putting a pound sign on a non-financial impact.
I mean, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the trade effects and soft power effects are you know, unimaginably large. The issue is, because of the success of the UK higher education sector, I mean, the more successful the UK higher education sector is, the harder it becomes to undertake that type of analysis, because you've got students coming from 200 countries, going back to 200 countries in multiple areas. It's exponentially difficult. So we'd love to do that. I think we would use up the entire £41 billion budget.
There might be approaches to tackle it.
I'm going to highlight difficult but not impossible, and then I'm going to highlight that that's the one area that I feel as a sector we've got to get better. We've got to get better in actually tracking where our international students are getting jobs when they go back to the home country, to show the real value on the education in the UK just now. So I do feel that's a piece of work that actually we've got to lean into as a sector and look to see what we can do in the future.
No, thank you. And so I think that's a good point to sort of end this point on. So thank you to Gavin and Linda for your contributions, and we'll now move to the panel discussion.
Thank you.
And so thank you. We'll now be moving on to the panel, as I mentioned, and we have 4 fantastic panelists joining us, so invite you to join. We have Professor Wendy Alexander, who is Vice Principal for International at the University of Dundee and the Scottish Government's International Trade and Investment Envoy for Higher Education. We have Wendy Thompson. In fact, if I can just bring all the panelists up now, please. We have Wendy Thompson joining us as Vice-Chancellor from the University of London, and I believe Alan Manning, who is Professor of Economics in the Department for Economics at LSE and was Chair of the Migration Advisory Committee from 2016 to 2020. And I think, have we got joining us? Yes. We have Sarah Kozhikova, who is co-chair of UKISA's Student Advisory Group, Student Commissioner for the International Higher Education Commission, and a master's student in cross-cultural communication and media studies at Newcastle University, and who I'm also imagining is extremely busy. So thank you all for joining us today. I think we've asked everyone to prepare just 5 minutes of opening remarks, 5 minutes or so, before again we will move to a sort of a discussion and Q&A. So do get your questions ready. So without further ado, I'll turn to Wendy Alexander for her remarks.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm delighted to be here. I want to use my 5 minutes to review what I think are the key headlines, what are the key implications, and what are the key solutions for us as a sector. If I start with the headlines, and this picks up on what's already been suggested by our audience, this is an extraordinary success story. You know, in our post-Brexit, low-growth, stagnant productivity environment, most sectors of the British economy would die for a 60% growth in net economic value in the last 6 years. It is an extraordinary success story. I think, secondly, it is a textbook example of levelling up. I think it's fair to say that there are not many economic league tables where Glasgow Central tops the UK performance of 650 constituencies. I say that as a resident of the neighbouring Glasgow North, which is also in the top 20 constituencies in the UK. So it's textbook levelling up success. Thirdly, as others have touched on, the character of international demand for higher education has changed profoundly. Today, 70% of international education demand comes from Asia and Africa, and yet 74% of the world's top 1,000 universities are in Europe, North America, or Oceania. So therefore, the choice for the UK, in the face of that hugely rising demand, is whether we want to sit out that global growth phenomenon as we did between 2012 and 2019, or we want to respond effectively to meeting the needs of those new cohorts of students. And that really brings me to the key implications, because those new students who are coming from Africa and South Asia, as others have pointed out, are different from the undergraduate Chinese or the undergraduate Europeans that we would have known a decade ago. Typically, they are older, they are postgraduate, they are more interested in employability, they're more interested in affordability, and they often have dependents, whether those dependents are here or those dependents are in their home countries. And as Gavin and others have pointed out, that does push up the costs associated with serving that community, albeit we are still extraordinarily successful in that place. The debate on dependence is nuanced, and I'm not going to deal with it in 5 minutes, but simply to say that the government's stance on denying local authorities and universities data on dependence is the very antithesis of joined-up government, because the starting point for solutions and solving new student challenges is sharing data with local authorities, universities, and introducing a proper planning function around new student flows. And I, like others, do hope that this research will encourage us and help us, frankly, along with the DFE, to persuade the Home Office that we should, for example, be mandating the modelling of place-based demand for accommodation for bed spaces with providers, with local authorities. Next thing I want to say in terms of implications is that this scale of growth means that there will be some attempts at fraud by those who are set on economic migration first and not on study first. And UKVI is onto that. It needs tackled. But in so doing, let us not demonize legitimate students who have the proper ambition to study here, to then move on to the graduate route, and move then onto the skilled route and contribute to our economy. So that brings me, I think I'm just in the 5 minutes, to the key solutions. And the key solutions touch again on some of the questions people have raised. I want to focus on one area, and that is longitudinal data, because I want to thank everyone who has made this piece of research possible. And I'm hoping Alan might say more about this, having chaired the MAC. How do we persuade the government of the need for proper longitudinal data in a sector that is worth over 40 billion to our economy? And let me give you just 2 examples of where the debate is being toxified because we don't have one version of the truth delivered by good longitudinal data. So the first one is, I think we do need to reassess some of our approaches to financial credibility. International students are meant to have the full financial resources assembled pre-departure. But the truth is that some of our generous fee payment plans invite students to earn while they learn once they're here. And I do think we need to look at whether that is in the interests of students, that they're trying to earn their fees as well as earn their keep once they have arrived in the UK. I think there are equity considerations there that we need to think further about. And on these financial credibility issues, UKVI currently relies on a single point in time data assessment and never revisits that issue. And I think, frankly, we can do better. Second area on key solutions is the one that others in the audience have already raised. This research only looks at the value of to the UK of these students during the time they're studying, but does not look at their longer term financial contribution back in their home country or in the UK. And I want just to dwell on that. We reintroduced the graduate route, very welcome, in 2019, where the government didn't commit to collect these graduates' long-term employment outcomes for us. So we have no decent data on graduate outcomes, whether those students stay here and avail themselves of the graduate route or move on to a skilled visa, or as the vast majority have done and will continue to do, to return to their own country. And it is a vital data lacuna that we need to fix if this debate is to be characterised by, as I say, one source of truth. We are currently in the realms of guesswork around overstayers or where people's careers take them later. And I think, in all honesty, it is more vital than ever, because it is clear that students from the new sending countries do want to avail themselves of the graduate route more so than some of their predecessors did in the past. But it will remain a minority who want to remain and build their lives here, and we need to therefore track both those who stay and those who return. So I'm out of time and I'm on to my conclusion. So I do think the right response to this extraordinary success and the new challenges is to act and not to blame. The solutions to the new sending countries are going to be a complex mix of sectoral, compliance, welfare, planning, housing and employment actions. That is where our competitors are, and it is where we should be. And I want also to finally end on saying, well, this is a fantastic British success story. Others have talked about the soft power dividends. I want to end on a note from Scotland. There is another way, because this week, the Talent Retention Unit of the Scottish Government began a survey of international students to look at how they could make the transition easier to the graduate route, to allow our international students to gain work experience and to support them in their return to their own country, or indeed to remain if they wish to do so. So I hope that's a little ray of sunshine at the end of the debate. The public do believe in the value of international students, but it becomes emotive when it gets mixed up in the migrant debate. And so this is a very valuable piece of research, and the starting point is that these students are a fantastic asset to the United Kingdom now and in the future. Thank you.
No, thank you, Wendy, and I think that excellent point around that kind of we need better data to inform good practice, and so that we can actually be making the positive case as well. I'll move swiftly on to Professor Thompson.
I don't think I've ever been on a platform with two Wendys, so that's a hegemonic experience. Anyway, thank you. Really pleased to join this discussion and really welcome the report. It's the third in this time series. I think it adds value as it gets reproduced over time. Really a great success story, as my colleague has said. I think the risk to this panel is that we could be in violent agreement. Although I don't know if Alan will agree or not, we'll find out, but that's an exciting contribution. But amongst the university world, I think it's hard not to celebrate this success in attracting students. It's a sign of the world-class experience as well as education that international students are getting here. We know that it's not our fantastic publicity and recruitment campaigns, it's word of mouth. That's what students listen to, and the word is out that this is the place to come. So this is a huge success. 41.9 billion gross, 37.4 billion net, obviously contributing far more than they cost. And, you know, the fact that students do study all over the UK, I also think punctures some of the myths that this is, you know, is just a one-way street to particular parts, you know, of the UK. It's obviously not. Mentioned Glasgow, but you've got Sheffield, Newcastle, Liverpool, Birmingham, all places getting huge benefit from international students. I mean, in one of my former lives, I've run local authorities. You know, we would cry out for that kind of investment. All the money we're getting in the olden days from, you know, ERDF, ESF, or in the current much more modest Prosperity Fund doesn't touch the size of the impact economically that these students are having. So, you know, the question I'll end with and come back to really is, you know, why are we having uncertainty in this policy environment, you know, when international students have such a compelling positive impact on the UK economy? I mean, that to me is the question. I mean, I'm Canadian, you can probably tell from the accent, this is not the debate they are having over there. They are having a, you know, a really competitive, aligned policy discussion about how they can get more international students into the Canadian university sector. So I think we have to wonder, why are we wondering about this? Anyway, I'm from the University of London, so obviously going to say something about London. It's clear that London is a powerful attraction to international students. 4 in 10 students in London are international. But again, it's not just, you know, Bloomsbury, Holborn and St Pancras, as the constituency level analysis says. But, you know, I ran Newham at one point. So when I see the levels of investment happening in West Ham and East Ham, again, celebration. But also Bermondsey, Poplar. These are areas, you know, where international students are a huge asset. Obviously not just economically, but in social terms as well. So, you know, you'd have to see the leveling up point, the one that Wendy's made as well. And it's not just sort of theoretical discussion in many parts of the UK and certainly in London. You know, we have really embraced the civic agenda. The University in London are not just in London, but they're of London. So, you know, I'm chairing a London Anchor Institution Network for the Mayor. I have regular meetings with the Mayor. You know, we're working across the London universities to see how we make sure that the money we spend, the people we employ, the students that we attract are making a direct impact on London's recovery. You know, we're present in the civic structures and we have lots of facts and figures, which I won't bore you with now, but we have lots of them showing, you know, the impact we make on procurement. We're using our apprenticeship levy to invest in SMEs. You know, there's a whole series, living wage employers. And so it's a direct and, you know, discernible impact. So it's not, you know, it's not just sort of a high-level economic analysis. And we know it's not just the money. You know, students do enrich our social capital. Even in a richly diverse population like London, students add another an important dimension. But I also think it's worth mentioning you know, the importance that they bring to enhancing the education in the classroom, but also allowing us to have a much wider array of programs than we could probably sustain on domestic tuition fees alone. And we haven't, you know, talked about the declining value of the domestic tuition fee, but I think we're all aware of it. You know, I think the latest estimate was it was about 6,200 against the 9.2 that it was when it was introduced in 2012. You know, we need to have a rich investment in our programs if we want to keep them topical and relevant. I mean, I know you could question the sustainability of this funding policy, but it's the one we've got. And there's a similar issue on the deficit on the research side, not to mention the entire uncertainty over our horizon and other research investments. So, you know, the students are bringing lots more than just the money that's recognized in this report. And the soft power dimension, I'll maybe just mention, because, you know, I travel around the world. We've got students in 189 countries, University of London. You know, we're on the decline on soft power, I would say, anecdotally, intuitively. We've managed just to hold our own in the brand finance survey that's done annually. You know, we just clung on to our second position after the US, but we declined by 10 ranks on one important position, which is the politically stable and well-governed. I mean, that's, you know, somebody who worked in international development, that's not one you want to decline that far in and hope to sustain your credibility in power terms. So, you know, why are we having this debate? Why are we so worried that, you know, this great success story could be undermined? Well, we're not meant to be political, but it's hard to avoid politics. And so I just thought I should mention, it seems to me to be a deeply political issue rather than an economic one. And today and yesterday, over the weekend, we can see how immigration is being placed at the top, particularly the conservative agenda. With this newly founded conservative democratic organization, it was where many speeches were being made, about immigration, and yesterday's statements from the Home Secretary. Labour's also concerned to get it right. I think it's a bit of a moral panic myself, but it is still a very, it's a real and topical issue. But really, if you look at the polling, it's not the top issue. When you look at the polling that was done just before the local election, immigration didn't feature. It was cost of living, NHS, crime and policing, even local environment. And immigration, according to Ipsos, is polled more than any other issue. So, it's consistent, and at the moment, it's only 6% of those polled see it as the top of their concerns. Even in the top 10 concerns, it's only 20% of the population. So it doesn't look like it's really a, follow the voters kind of answer to the question of why we're doing this. The second reason, as former civil servant, I think is also because they can do something about it. It's really going to be very hard to turn off the tap on skilled workers visas, very hard to turn the tap off on high-value migrants. But you may tell me, you may know more about this than I do, Alan, but it strikes me as those are politically tricky, whereas, the student visa looks maybe a little bit more amenable, not necessarily going to impact so immediately. But when you see and the boats, obviously a small number, relatively speaking, but a very big issue. So in this heated debate, I don't think we can take the politics out of it. I think as universities, what we bring to this in our time-honored tradition, is some rational debate, and we need to try and find a voice to express these hard economic and social and political arguments in a way that can be heard. I'm not sure we always manage this, but it is important. It's a massive success, and this report helps us make that story. I'll make just, I think I can say some small footnote in one other point is that actually this debate extends even beyond our shores, because there's a big transnational education component of this, which the University of London has a particular penchant for. We've been doing it since 1858, so when people suggest that this is like a late sort of thing we just woke up to after COVID, we sort of feel that not quite true. So this is a long-standing commitment we've made. There's a huge demand for higher education around the world. The ILO studies show what, a relatively small proportion of people working in developing countries have a tertiary education. We can meet that demand at a much lower price point than people who can come here to the UK. But this kind of hostile debate, really, makes us have to confront arguments coming back to us in these countries about, what's going on with higher education in the UK. Why is there such a debate about the value of international study, and it would be shame to lose our hard-won progress in getting recognition for distance and digital education in the middle of this what feels like a more political argument. Anyway, I think that's all I need to say for the moment. I think obviously more data, more rationality would help, but I think finding the voice to bring that into some of the really amplified political debates is what we need to find ways to do. Thank you.
No, thank you, Wendy. And I think that point about putting it in the global context as well, what are other countries doing as well, and how the debates are playing out in different countries is also a really important thing to reflect on. I'll hand over now to Professor Manning, if you want to make your contribution.
Yes, so I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here, a lot to like, but to avoid the danger of just having a love in, I'm going to be a little bit focused on the sort of places where I disagree. But there's a risk in doing that of overstating how much I disagree. And I'm going to make 3 points. First of all, I do think the methodology overstates the benefit to the UK economy. Secondly, I think London campuses are perhaps more important than was perhaps hinted at here in the geographical impacts. And thirdly, I think it sort of doesn't focus on the sort of policy issues sort of so much, and I'll say a little bit about that. So first of all, Gavin has already said a little bit about that. in these kind of exercises, you have measures of the direct impacts like tuition fee income, how much the students spend, the visitor income, and then you apply a multiplier to that to get the total benefit. This paper uses a multiplier of 2. If you compare, that is large relative to what other studies are using in comparable exercises. If you look, for example, at the estimates of the cost to the British economy of the Brexit-induced reduction in trade with the EU, that's using a multiplier of 1/2, not a 2. And I personally think 1/2 is more plausible than 2. So really the benefits here are more like 10 than 40 billion. 10 billion still, you know, a lot of money, but it's less than 40 billion. The second thing, on the sort of regional distribution, these are the top 15 sort of reasonably sized institutions by growth rate in terms of international postgraduate students over the last 3 years, and whether they're London based. And as you can see, only 3 of them are based in London, and it looks fantastic. There's a Scottish one, a Welsh one, a Northern Irish one, there's an institution in the northeast. You then go to ask a bit deeper, how many of these institutions have a presence in London? And you suddenly see, well, all of the ones in those areas I've just mentioned, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Northeast, have a London campus. In fact, only 5 of the 15 don't have some kind of presence in London, and 2 of those 5 are within a 30-minute train ride of London, so are basically London adjacent. And these London campuses, I think, are mostly existing in order to target international students. So I think actually the impacts of international students are more concentrated in London than perhaps this study is suggesting. Okay. Now this kind of exercise, you know, looks at the contribution of international students as a whole, as if, you know, the question is, international students, good or bad, yes or no? Whereas actually the policy questions are things like, at the margin, should we make our offer, the graduate visa, for example, more or less generous? And that, you know, so, and how changing at the margin alters numbers, alters types of students. And I think the graduate visa has really dramatically changed things. It's always been the case, it's a good thing, that universities are not just selling an education, they're selling an increased opportunity to work in the UK. But the graduate visa so alters that balance between the two that we will have students who will be prepared to pay even if the qualifications are totally worthless and if the only work they can get is at the minimum wage. And just to sort of illustrate that, you know, you can get a 1-year master's for 15K, you pay another 3K in visa charges. You can, the total amount of work, even just at the minimum wage, you're going to be able to make 50,000 over the course of your study year plus the graduate visa, more than double that if you had a dependent. And what that means is that the studying in the UK just becomes an attractive economic proposition. Forget about the study component, it's all about the work component. And then the limits on numbers are really the unis being concerned about quality. But perhaps some of them really, really like the money. So, you know, so there may be some of them that are not so that. So if these are concerns, what would we expect to see? We'd expect to see very rapid growth, especially in 1-year masters, because you only have to pay 1 year of fees. In rapid growth in dependents more than main applicants from lower income countries where even things like minimum wage work in the UK are relatively attractive, into lower quality institutions, and then disappointing labour market outcomes. And we see all of those things at the moment. Some are kind of well known, very rapid growth in total numbers, even faster among dependents. It's basically all in 1 year postgraduate master's degrees. There's sort of nothing happening in research or undergraduate degrees. It's much faster in the less selective institutions. So there's growth in all institutions, but the fastest growth is in the least selective British institutions. And that's consistent with institutions that perhaps their entrance requirements not so strict. In terms of labour market outcomes, we're beginning to see reports like students switching from student visas to work visas in the social care sector where they are going to be paid minimum wage. So these will be postgraduate master's students deciding a better option is minimum wage work in the social care sector. Those kind of things are slightly, I think, should be slightly concerned about. And in terms of long run outcomes, you know, which I think Wendy talked about data, which we actually have fantastic data, but we don't. Using it is slightly different question. If you look at, this is the 2009 cohort when we had a sort of graduate visa 10 years later. Now for UK and EU students, you see the pattern that you would expect to see, that if you have a higher degree, you earn more. If you have a PhD relative to a master's, relative to an undergraduate, earnings all go in the same level. And you see that for EU students as well, but you don't see that for non-EU students. What you actually see is that for non-EU master's students, 25% of them 10 years later who've remained in the UK are basically in minimum wage work. And you know, that again is, I think, you know, something that we should be slightly worried about those economic outcomes. We can talk about the reasons for that. So where are we now? I think it looks increasingly possible we're going to see some changes to the graduate visa. I think that's really bad if that's a knee-jerk reaction to record-breaking headline net migration figures. It's very likely to be that. But I do think there are underlying issues. And I think the sector didn't really do due diligence on the graduate visa when introduced. There are risks associated with it which were paid no attention, which are sort of around very fast growth, gaps between rhetoric and reality. All the talk is about, you know, global talent, and then you've got a lot of quite a sizable tail of essentially minimum wage workers as a result. And then there are also, I think, possibilities of scandal in this sector, which would be associated with individual institutions, but would conceivably drag the whole sector down with them. So I think there are some, my view is there are issues of concern in here. So in some sense, government's kind of right to be looking at this. Don't have a great deal of confidence in the way they're going to do it right now, though. Thank you.
No, thank you, Alan. I think two reflections immediately. One, it's good that we're not just in an echo chamber here telling ourselves that everything is fantastic, but also I think the kind of the points you raise on this final slide are actually things that people have already raised in this room. So I think it is right that these are the issues that we are all concerned with, and I think there needs to be a really proper reflection on as well. But before we go into the discussion, I'll hand over to Sarah for her reflections.
Thank you. So it felt really fascinating to read a report that I am basically directly involved in as an international student, but at the same time it felt really weird to read it as well, but I'm grateful that I have the opportunity to respond to it. So I would probably start by saying that I think it is really important to write a report like that because people don't seem to understand the economic benefits that international students bring to the UK. I still remember when I did my undergrad at Portsmouth and I overheard a conversation when I was walking through the city centre, and there were two people discussing how international students come to the UK, they take all the money away, they take the jobs then they leave. And that really made me think, that was just a couple of years ago, and that made me think people don't really know how much we actually give back. So I think from this point of view, it is really important to talk about this. But at the same time, you know, it felt really weird to read about how much I'm worth to the UK in money. That feels really weird when you are reading about yourself, basically. But as a European student, I am really pleased that there was a mention of European students in the report. I think that after Brexit and after everything that happened, we don't really receive as much attention as we should, which makes me really sad. And also based on the report, what really shocked me was that 1 in 4 all international students used to be European, which is now 1 in 12. Which I think that's a massive difference. And it also made me think, you know, what about us in the future report? Because currently I'm a European student who has a pre-settled status, which means data-wise, I'm home because I have home tuition fees. But my needs are very different to home students. I am still international. I just already feel forgotten about because there are many issues that higher education institutions just don't seem to be addressing when it comes to European students with pre-settled status. So I'm just wondering, are we going to take that into consideration in the future? And when I read the report and I was thinking about how to respond to it, it actually made me think about 3 issues that I wanted to mention. Firstly, you know, based on the report and on the current politics in higher education sector and in international higher education sector in particular, I feel like we are all aware that there is probably a need, as the report says, to diversify recruitment on campuses beyond China and East Asia. However, when we do recruit from other parts of the world, like India or Nigeria, then we are met with opposing opinions about, oh, what if these students bring dependents? And to me, as a student, that feels a bit like cherry picking. It feels a bit like the UK wants international students, but only if. You know, there are many conditions, and I don't really like that. Also, when we do recruit students and we realize they are actually coming here to study, which means they might want a job afterwards, we actually made their lives harder with all the speculations around post-study visa and post-study conditions in general. They keep changing, and there is a lot of speculation in the media, and it doesn't look good when you are abroad and you read about that as a potential student, perhaps. And the last thing that, you know, makes me feel quite embarrassed, being in the UK and really feeling at home here now, it feels a bit like the UK was striving to increase the number of international students, which we all know has been achieved, and it's been a huge success, way ahead of deadline. But now what I read in the media is all the discussions around, okay, so what do we do now with this many students? Are we even able to accommodate that? So that also just doesn't really add up, and I don't feel comfortable that the UK kind of doesn't know what they want. We don't know. Do we want more international students? Do we want fewer international students? Are we prepared to have more international students? And also, again, from a point of view of an EU student, I see loads of issues that aren't being addressed. So I'm not sure if we are ready to host more international students. And what was also very interesting in the report was the acknowledgement that EU students are less likely to bring dependents as compared to other students. And that made me wonder, okay, is the UK now going to try and target or attract EU students more to solve the issues it seems to have with students who bring dependents? To be completely honest, I would love to see a stronger link between the UK and EU because I'm European and I really miss that. However, if this happened, it would actually really disappoint me because I would interpret that as a way of tactically trying to attract who we want. It's the cherry-picking recruitment policy, in my opinion, because there are so many issues that European students who are already here in the UK face that higher education institutions are just not willing to address. So I don't think we should be recruiting more if we can't solve issues for students who are already in the country. And so I think it's needless to say that I think the UK is currently in a rather difficult situation, but I would dare to say that the UK is actually creating the difficult situation. I think the issues that I mentioned, such as the cherry-picking recruitment policy, okay, we want international students, but only if they are like this or they are like that. Also, all the debate around reducing the time that students can spend in the UK after their studies is just, there is so much confusion, and I'm not I'm not surprised that if students are thinking about where to study, they wouldn't pick a country that keeps going back and forth. It just needs to be addressed. And also, that looks like we are unable to make a decision about what we want. And so this sends a conflicting message abroad. It sends a conflicting message to students who might be thinking about where they want to study. And I just really wish that we address that as well, beyond just the economic benefits. And lastly, don't forget that we are such a diverse group of people. And when you are discussing international students, see us and hear us. Each one of us, even if we come from the same country, each one of us has a completely different story, a completely different skill set, and we enrich this country way beyond just the money. I understand the importance of talking about that. I understand that. But you see, I am a real human being. So see us and not numbers on a spreadsheet. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think really recognising that kind of really diverse contribution that all international students make, but that need for stability and certainty as well. What are we actually sort of joining when moving to a country? We've only got a few minutes left. I just want to ask if our panelists were able to stay for another kind of 5 minutes until about kind of 5 past, so we can take a couple of questions. I'll move straight to the floor then. I think there's a question over here.
Hiya, thank you for an interesting discussion. I just wanted to ask whether universities should do more to engage local communities if it is indeed a levelling up success story.
No, thank you for that. Wendy. Or Wendy.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I think they should, and I think there's a lot of examples of where that is taking place. I think the civic university agenda really has taken off in the last few years around the whole of the UK. And certainly if I look at the universities in our federation, many of them have local, civic engagement charters in some of their local councils, whether it's, Southwark or Lambeth or Westminster, and we have it with the GLA and London councils as a whole. So I think it is really important. It's also on the micro issues, and we run a lot of student accommodation and private rented as well. And it's important that those relationships are well managed and used to enrich the whole neighbour experience. So I would certainly say yes, and I don't think there would be many people who would, in our sector, who would say otherwise, really.
No. And Wendy, from your experience at University of Dundee?
Yes. And one of the reasons it's so hard is the Home Office resolutely refuses to tell you how many dependent visas they are issuing. So you can't have a grown-up conversation with your local authority about how many pre-5, how many school children, how many bed spaces for families. So I think it's easily solved in the pre-matriculation space if we get some movement there. I think the interesting point that Alan makes is the one about what happens when people graduate, whether they stay or whether they go home. You're right, there hasn't been the due diligence in the graduate route, but I think where we would part company is it's not the responsibility of universities to track where their graduates are living or working a decade after they graduate. It is a proper question, but that is the responsibility of central government, so that with the new graduate route, we have the sort of data that we had with the old one, which is now 15 years gone. I'll leave it there.
No, thanks, Wendy. Alan, was there anything you wanted to add to that at all?
Just very quickly, when we did a MAT report in 2018, we looked as far as we could at community feelings about local students, and there wasn't really any evidence of negative feelings at that time.
No, thank you. And I think the polling that Public First did for Universities UK a few weeks ago did actually sort of suggest the same as well. Do we have any more questions in the room at all? One down here.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting panel discussion. I suppose just, I'm from Universities UK. I guess sort of focusing in on perhaps some of the really interesting pushback from Alan on, I guess, some of the points he raised. The point around, I guess, future earnings and sort of what happens post-graduation for international students. I suppose the sort of rationale and the thought behind the graduate route, from my perspective, would always be that these are international students who have decided to invest in our education system, in our country, and therefore the graduate route is a sort of an opportunity for them to sort of explore the future possibility to work. Would the concerns that you raise about future earnings be addressed by the sort of wider immigration system? And so the graduate route is temporary. It obviously doesn't count towards settlement. Would it be at that point that after that 2-year period or after that 3-year period, if there is concerns around earnings and what international graduates are doing, that's where you would be able to address that concern, i.e. they would need to be switching into skilled work and making sure they're earning kind of sufficient money and in roles that we value as a society and as an economy? Thank you.
No, thanks, Harry.
Alan. Yeah, so we do know a little bit about that. So like, if we take that 2009 cohort from a different data source, we know that roughly 15 to 20% are sort of still in the UK, sort of long term. But they're going through all sorts of routes. I mean, so some are sort of settling down with someone, so they become a family migrant. Some are getting skilled worker visas. Some are actually claiming asylum. And there's all sorts of, it's very, very mixed. But there is a gap between what the lower tail. I should emphasize that there were some fantastically very high-performing graduates, but there is a tail which are not performing in the labour market, don't have labour market outcomes which is commensurate with what their paper qualifications say they have, the skills they have. That's the issue.
No, thank you, Alan. I think we've got a couple of questions online as well.
I have a question from Shell Morgan that picks up on your comment, Wendy, that universities don't know who is coming and who is bringing dependents. And is there a way for universities to be able to get hold of that data? Or is it time for a UCAS equivalent at PGT level so that universities can understand who is coming in and do planning for those international families?
So given the time briefly, we don't have it because the Home Office won't give us it, but I don't want learned helplessness on behalf of the sector. And the underlying point is, for home students, we have HESA, which is an extraordinarily detailed track of every aspect of the experience, and I'm pushing hard because of the scale for that sort of granularity of data, both in pre-arrival and dependence during study and post-study for graduate outcomes. I'll leave it there in time.
No, thank you. Was there another question as well?
Yeah. Given the hard facts regarding the economic... Sorry, I'll start again. Given that hard facts regarding economic benefit do not always make an impact, what else can be done to show politicians and the media that hosting international students is a good thing?
No, thank you. Maybe, Sarah, do you want to start on that, given you've already touched on some of these things?
I was actually thinking about that question as well. I think, for example, the We Are International program we have that we lead in UKISA, I think that is a great way of showcasing the real stories and the real faces. And I'm afraid that, that is probably not an easy solution because you actually have to go and talk to people. But I think that is probably the only other solution how to bring the real face into the conversation, because talking about money and the economic value might be a bit easier because you have data and you can calculate it and the data don't really talk, so it's easy. But I think if we really want to show the politicians the good side, and not only them, but the whole communities, the good side of hosting international students, we actually have to go and engage with international students and support programs like We Are International and any other initiative that actually involves the student voice.
No, thank you. And I think this is timely to remind everyone that we are relaunching the We Are International campaign over the next couple of weeks, working with UKISA and others, really to emphasise that kind of wider contribution alongside the economic impact as well. And I think that's going to be critically important. Do we have one more question in the room? Nuncio.
It's actually slightly esoteric for Professor Manning. So you mentioned that the analysis from London Economics uses a multiplier of 2, and you said that maybe the post-Brexit analysis using a multiplier of 0.5 might be more applicable. But surely, if these students are spending money in their local economies, then the Keynesian economics would suggest that a multiplier of 1.5 or 2 is more reasonable. Maybe it's the post-Brexit multiplier, which is not quite so reasonable at 0.5.
Do you want me to ask? It's a bit so a Keynesian multiplier is appropriate in an economy where there are lots and lots of unused resources. We're not in that. We're not in that situation. We're pretty low unemployment. The argument is that, so imagine the LSE has no international students. So suddenly 3/4 of my income disappears, something like that. The question is, do I have any ability to find other sources of income? Am I employable in any other thing? Don't answer that question. But the model here assumes no, I'm totally unemployable elsewhere, whereas the Brexit analysis assumes I couldn't replace all my lost income, but I would have some way of replacing some of it. So that's where a multiplier less than 1 comes from.
No, thank you. And I'm aware we're already over time. I had sort of one more quick question that I just wanted to ask everyone for maybe 30 seconds reflection. Given the conversations that we've seen in the public eye, you managed to get the Prime Minister alone for 30 seconds. What's the one message that you'd want to give them? Start with Wendy.
I'm going to draw on Alan, which is to say, yes, to Rishi you would say, yes, the graduate visa has altered the balance between work and study, but we are alongside every single major Anglophone country in the world of trying to meet that demand with the soft power benefits of it. It would be a mistake for us to step off the bus again. You and Boris got it right. Stick with it.
Thank you. Professor Thompson.
Well, this is a success story. If you want to be global Britain, higher education is a major lever for achieving that.
Thank you. Professor Manning?
Don't switch between having your foot flat down on the accelerator and then slamming on the brakes. Try to make me not throw up in the car, please.
Thank you. And the final word to Sarah.
I would say make a decision and stick to it, and see us and hear us when you are making that decision.
Thank you. I think that seems like an excellent point to end on. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here today, everyone who's joined us online, to Linda, to Gavin, and to Nick, and the work that the organisations have done to really bring this fantastic research together. But mostly our panellists. So we have Wendy Alexander, Wendy Thompson, Alan Manning, and Sarah. I'm terribly sorry I've forgotten your surname. Kazak. Thank you very much.